Laziness is rarely a lack of strength. It is usually a mind that has learned to delay pain and chase comfort. The samurai understood this long before neuroscience gave it a name. They did not wait for motivation. They trained their nervous system to move before the mind began negotiating. A samurai woke before dawn not because he felt disciplined, but because the body had been taught obedience through repetition. Steel was sharpened daily even when there was no battle. Breath was controlled when fear rose. Action came first. Emotion followed later. Modern life reverses this order. You wait to feel ready. You wait to feel inspired. The mind grows soft from endless choice and the body learns hesitation as a habit. Over time, inaction begins to feel natural, even safe. The samurai technique is not about willpower. It is about reprogramming the reflex that chooses comfort over direction. It is about building a system where movement becomes automatic and delay feels unnatural. This path does not shout. It does not rush. It simply waits for the moment you notice how often your life pauses at the edge of action. Chapter 1: The Awakening. You wake up with intention already exhausted. Not because the day has begun, but because the mind has rehearsed avoidance before the body even moves. There is a weight in the chest, a quiet resistance that says later, not now. This is not laziness as failure. It is laziness as a trained response. The samurai would recognize this state immediately. They called it the moment before the blade leaves the sheath. Not fear. Not weakness. But hesitation. Hesitation is the real enemy. It is the pause where the mind pretends to protect you while slowly eroding your edge. In modern life, hesitation is rewarded. Comfort is abundant. Delay feels harmless. You tell yourself you will begin after rest, after clarity, after the mood improves. Each delay teaches the nervous system a lesson. Action is optional. Discomfort is dangerous. Over time, the body stops offering energy because it has learned that energy will not be used. This is the cycle. Intention rises. Resistance answers. Delay follows. Guilt appears. Energy collapses. The cycle repeats until inaction feels like identity. The samurai awakening begins when this pattern is seen without drama. No self-hatred. No motivation speeches. Just clear observation. The warrior notices that the mind always speaks first, and it always speaks in the language of safety. The body waits for orders that never come. In Zen monasteries, novices were awakened with cold water or sudden bells. Not to punish them, but to interrupt habit. Awakening is interruption. The realization that what feels natural may simply be familiar. Here, a subtle shift occurs. You stop asking why you feel lazy and start noticing when laziness appears. You see that it arrives at predictable moments. At the threshold of effort. At the edge of uncertainty. Right before growth. This noticing is not passive. It is the first act of discipline. There is a quiet moment when you realize that the problem is not that you cannot act. It is that you have been waiting for permission from a mind designed to conserve energy, not build purpose. This is where the samurai path opens. Not with force, but with awareness sharp enough to cut through excuses. If this pattern feels familiar, it is because you have been standing at this gate for a long time without naming it. Chapter 2: The Ancient Principle. The samurai did not fight laziness directly. They understood something more precise. The mind seeks ease by default, but it obeys structure when structure is older and stronger than mood. This was the ancient principle. Form before feeling. In Zen training halls, monks bowed, swept floors, and walked prescribed paths not for tradition alone, but to engrave order into the nervous system. The samurai adopted the same discipline. They trusted ritual more than intention. A ritual does not ask how you feel. It asks only whether you will show up. Modern psychology now mirrors this wisdom. The brain conserves energy by avoiding uncertainty. When a task feels undefined or emotionally heavy, the mind delays. It labels the delay as rest, but the body experiences it as stagnation. Over time, the brain learns that hesitation is the safest option. The samurai dismantled this by removing choice. Morning practice began at the same moment every day. Armor was cleaned in the same sequence. Sword drills followed fixed counts. Repetition reduced mental negotiation. Action became reflex. This principle rests on a simple truth. The mind is not designed to lead. It is designed to comment. When you let it lead, it will choose comfort every time. When you let form lead, the mind falls into place behind it. Neuroscience calls this habit loop encoding. Repeated actions performed under stable conditions move from conscious effort into automatic execution. The samurai lived inside this loop intentionally. They did not wait for courage. Courage emerged because the body was already moving. There is a quiet danger in believing you must feel ready. Readiness is a sensation, and sensations fluctuate. Structure does not. Structure remains when enthusiasm disappears. Here, something subtle happens. The struggle becomes smaller, not because the task is easier, but because the argument disappears. The ancient principle teaches that discipline is not self-control. It is self-placement. You place yourself inside a form that carries you forward when the will grows weak. This is why the samurai trained even in peace. Especially in peace. Without pressure, habits reveal their true shape. If discipline survives comfort, it will survive chaos. When this principle is applied, laziness is no longer an enemy to fight. It is a signal that form is missing. Where structure collapses, hesitation grows. The samurai did not ask how to defeat laziness. They asked a quieter question. What form will move me when I no longer want to move? That question still waits for an answer in every modern life that feels stalled. Chapter 3, The Internal War. Inside every moment of procrastination, a silent conflict unfolds. It is not between discipline and laziness, but between two ancient systems within the body. One seeks survival through conservation. The other seeks meaning through action. When you feel stuck, these systems are not confused. They are competing. The samurai understood this war intimately. Before battle, the body floods with signals. Heart rate rises. Breath shortens. Muscles tighten. This is not fear in the emotional sense. It is the nervous system preparing for uncertainty. If this energy is not directed immediately, the mind steps in to reinterpret it as danger. Modern neuroscience calls this the threat response. The brain detects effort, ambiguity, or potential failure and activates protection. Protection feels like hesitation. It whispers reasons. It offers distractions. It reframes avoidance as intelligence. This is where laziness is born. Not from lack of drive, but from mismanaged arousal. The samurai trained to move inside this state. They did not try to calm the body first. They acted while the body was activated. Sword drills were performed with elevated heart rates. Meditation was practiced under physical strain. The message to the nervous system was clear. Activation does not mean stop. Activation means proceed with precision. In modern life, the opposite training occurs. When discomfort appears, you retreat. You scroll. You postpone. You soothe. The nervous system learns a new rule. Discomfort equals danger. Stillness equals safety. Over time, the threshold for action rises. Tasks that once felt neutral now trigger resistance. The internal war intensifies. The mind becomes louder. The body becomes heavier. This war cannot be won by thought alone. Thinking is part of the conflict. Every internal debate strengthens the avoidance pathway. The samurai resolved this by shortening the distance between signal and movement. They trusted the body to lead through the first step. Not the whole task. Just the initial motion. Hand to sword. Foot forward. Breath anchored. Once movement begins, the nervous system recalibrates. Threat diminishes. Energy reorganizes. There is a moment, small but decisive, when the body realizes it is safe to act. That moment never arrives before movement. It arrives because of movement. This is the quiet truth modern productivity often misses. You do not wait for calm to begin. Calm is a byproduct of beginning. The internal war ends not with victory, but with alignment. When the body learns that effort does not equal harm, resistance loses its power. If you watch closely, you can feel this conflict arise each day. Right before starting. Right before committing. That is the battlefield. The samurai did not eliminate this moment. They mastered how to cross it. Chapter 4, The System. The samurai never relied on effort alone. Effort fluctuates. Systems endure. What protected them from laziness was not intensity, but a framework so simple it removed choice. When choice disappears, Hesitation starves. The system began with non-negotiable rules. Not goals. Not aspirations. Rules. Wake before sunrise. Train before eating. Clean weapons before rest. These actions were not debated. They were executed. The mind learned quickly that resistance had no audience. This matters because laziness thrives on negotiation. The moment you ask yourself whether to act, the nervous system scans for comfort. The samurai cut this loop by deciding in advance. Decisions made once, repeated daily, conserve mental energy and prevent emotional bargaining. Modern psychology confirms this. Decision fatigue weakens self-regulation. Each choice drains resources. A fixed system preserves them. The samurai lived inside a narrow corridor of behavior so their strength could be spent on mastery, not on deciding what to do next. The system also honored sequence. Small actions first. Always. Armor before sword. Breath before movement. Posture before strike. This taught the body that progress begins with alignment, not force. When you start small, the nervous system remains regulated. Momentum builds without shock. Here, a quiet shift takes place. You stop trying to become disciplined and start behaving like someone who already is. The samurai system was identity-based. They did not say I will train today. They lived as those who train daily. Action was not a task. It was a confirmation of who they were. This is the core reprogramming. Identity precedes motivation. When behavior confirms identity, laziness loses its argument. The mind no longer asks why. It recognizes this as normal. The system also included closure. Every session ended the same way. Cleaning. Stillness. Order restored. This told the nervous system the effort was complete. Without closure, the brain resists beginning again. Completion creates safety. Many modern routines fail because they are too ambitious and too vague. The samurai system was strict and narrow. Few actions. Clear order. Repetition without variation. If you feel resistance rising as you imagine such structure, notice that reaction. It reveals how deeply the mind has grown accustomed to flexibility as avoidance. The system does not cage you. It carries you. Once in place, you no longer ask how to overcome laziness. You simply step into the next action, already decided long before the moment arrives. Chapter 5, Practice Without Gaps. The samurai believed that discipline is not proven in intensity, but in continuity. One missed day was not failure. 2 missed days were a warning. Gaps were where identity leaked out. Practice without gaps does not mean perfection. It means refusal to disappear. On days when strength was high, training was full. On days when the body was heavy, training was reduced to form. A single strike. A single bow. A single breath held in posture. Something was always done. This principle protected the nervous system from collapse. When effort drops to zero, restarting feels dangerous. The brain treats return as a new threat. But when action never fully stops, the system remains warm. Re-entry feels natural. Modern discipline often breaks because it demands too much or nothing at all. You push hard until exhaustion, then vanish. The samurai avoided this cycle by honoring minimums. The minimum was sacred. It preserved continuity. There is a quiet moment here where something changes. You stop judging the day and start protecting the chain. Neuroscience supports this ancient restraint. Habit strength is maintained by frequency, not magnitude. Small, repeated actions reinforce neural pathways more reliably than sporadic intensity. The body learns trust through consistency. The samurai also trained under uneven conditions. Some days were sharp. Some were dull. They did not interpret dullness as a sign to stop. They interpreted it as part of the terrain. Practice adapted, but it never vanished. This is how laziness is outgrown rather than fought. Laziness thrives on the fantasy of tomorrow. Practice without gaps collapses that fantasy into now. When you reduce the requirement to something undeniable, resistance loses its leverage. The mind cannot argue against 1 minute. The body cannot fear 1 step. Yet these small actions carry the weight of identity. Over time, something profound occurs. You no longer rely on discipline to begin. Beginning becomes familiar. Familiar becomes safe. Safe becomes automatic. The samurai did not ask if the practice felt meaningful each day. Meaning accumulated because the practice remained. If you look closely at your own life, you will see where the gaps live. Not in effort, but in continuity. Not in ambition, but in disappearance. Close the gaps, and laziness has nowhere to stand. Chapter 6, Environmental Design. The samurai understood that willpower is a fragile resource. They did not test it unnecessarily. They shaped their environment so discipline required less effort than distraction. The surroundings did the work before the mind could interfere. Weapons were placed where hands would naturally fall. Training spaces were bare. Sleep quarters were orderly. Nothing invited delay. Nothing tempted excess. The environment whispered a single instruction. Begin. Modern laziness is often blamed on character, but it is more accurately a response to chaotic surroundings. When tools are hidden, when notifications interrupt, when comfort is always within reach, the nervous system remains scattered. Focus becomes an uphill climb. Environmental design reverses this burden. You remove friction from the actions you want repeated and increase friction for the actions you want weakened. This is not force. It is quiet engineering. The samurai never stored armor far from practice grounds. Distance breeds excuses. Proximity breeds action. In the same way, when your tools are visible and prepared, beginning feels natural. When distractions require effort to access, resistance fades before it forms. There is a subtle dignity in this approach. You stop blaming yourself and start respecting your limits. You acknowledge that the mind will wander and you plan accordingly. This is not weakness. It is wisdom. Here, a quiet shift occurs. You stop trying to win every internal battle and begin arranging fewer battles to fight. The nervous system responds immediately. Order in the environment signals safety. Safety allows sustained effort. Chaos signals threat. Threat triggers avoidance. The samurai also honored rhythm. Certain spaces were for action. Certain spaces were for rest. These boundaries were not blurred. When rest becomes mixed with effort, neither recovers properly. When effort invades rest, resistance grows. Clear boundaries protect continuity. Environmental design extends to time as well. Training occurred at fixed hours. Meals followed effort. Sleep followed order. The body learned when to activate and when to release. This predictability stabilized energy and reduced internal conflict. If you examine your own environment honestly, you will see how it trains you every day. It teaches you what is easy to begin and what is easy to avoid. It teaches you whether focus is normal or rare. The samurai never asked whether they felt like training when they entered the dojo. The space itself answered for them. When your environment aligns with your intent, discipline feels less like control and more like gravity. You are pulled toward the next correct action without strain. Change the space, and the mind will follow. Chapter 7, Transformation. Transformation in the samurai path was never dramatic. No sudden surge of confidence. No permanent victory over resistance. What changed was quieter and far more stable. The relationship with action itself. The old self waited. The new self moves. Through repetition, structure, continuity, and environment, the nervous system learns a different truth. Effort is not a threat. Beginning is not dangerous. Discomfort is temporary and survivable. This learning does not happen through insight. It happens through lived evidence. The samurai did not become disciplined by thinking differently. They became disciplined by behaving consistently enough that the body stopped arguing. When the body stops arguing, the mind follows. This is the moment of transformation. Not when laziness disappears, but when it loses authority. It may still whisper. It may still suggest delay. But it no longer decides. You begin to notice something unexpected. Action feels lighter. Starting no longer drains you. The first step carries you instead of costing you. This is not motivation. It is alignment. Identity has shifted. You are no longer someone trying to be disciplined. You are someone who practices. Someone who shows up. Someone whose life moves forward even on low energy days. The samurai measured mastery by reliability, not intensity. Could they act under dullness? Could they continue under comfort? Could they remain steady without an audience? Your transformation follows the same arc. The days blur together. Progress feels ordinary. And that is the proof. What once required force now requires presence. There is a calm that arrives when you trust yourself to act. Anxiety fades because decisions are already made. Guilt fades because disappearance is no longer an option. Energy returns because it is finally being used. This path does not make life easy. It makes it clear. And clarity is what dissolves laziness at its root. The final question is not whether you can maintain this discipline forever. It is simpler and more honest. Who do you become when action is no longer something you debate, but something you embody? That answer will reveal itself quietly, one deliberate step at a time. Conclusion. The samurai technique does not promise endless energy or a life free from resistance. It offers something far more durable. A mind that no longer treats hesitation as truth. A body that understands movement as safety, not threat. Laziness fades when it is no longer fed by gaps, chaos, and negotiation. It fades when structure replaces mood, when continuity replaces intensity, when identity replaces effort. This is not a battle won once. It is a stance maintained quietly, day after day. The samurai did not conquer themselves. They arranged themselves. Their lives were shaped so the next correct action required less courage than avoidance. Over time, this alignment became character. In the modern world, the same principle applies. You do not need more motivation. You need fewer decisions. You do not need to fight your mind. You need to stop asking it for permission. When action becomes normal, discipline stops feeling heavy. When discipline becomes normal, freedom appears. Not the freedom of comfort, but the freedom of direction. This path is not loud. No one may notice it from the outside. But inside, something fundamental changes. You trust yourself again. You move when it is time to move. You rest without guilt. You act without drama. The samurai technique leaves you with a quiet strength. Not the strength to force life forward, but the strength to meet it without retreat. And in that steadiness, you will recognize a version of yourself that was never lazy, only waiting to be guided correctly.